Recording in progress.
Good morning, everybody. Looking forward to sharing with you from John 5 today. Before I do, I'm going to jump into just a quick prayer. Lord, I pray that you'd be with us today. I pray that you'd help me as I try to go through John 5 and point out some things that might help the students to better understand and for this to take root in their lives. And I just pray that you'd help the students to understand. I pray that you'd help them to learn from your word, not from me, God, but from your word. And that I might just be able to help them and guide them through doing that to some extent, Lord. We pray most importantly, God, that our lives would be changed, that we'd grow closer to you by reading your word and by studying your word. And we thank you for giving us your word, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. So I've already put my slides up here. You can see we're studying the Gospel of John, and this week we're studying John 5 and 6. I'm going to break down today and some of this into smaller chunks. And today we're just going to go through John 5, 1 through 18. And here we're going to see Jesus healing the lame man at the pool in Jerusalem. And I'm kind of focusing obviously on Cook's commentary and walking us through both the gospel, but also some of the comments in Cook's commentary and hopefully adding some value to that as we go. One of the big themes here in John that we're getting to is going to be now to see some escalation of conflict. Up until this point, we didn't see a ton of conflict. We did see some things like Jesus cleansing the temple. I'm sure there was some conflict involved there. But here we're going to see some more direct conflict and an escalation of that. In chapters 5 through 10 of John's gospel, we want to kind of get our bearings here for a second. Remember, first, of course, we're in the Gospel of John. Secondly, John's Gospel starts out with the prologue and then goes into a large section called the Book of Signs. We're within that section, but even within that section now in this chapters 5 through 10, we can kind of break that down as a subsection that is commonly referred to as the festival cycle. And the goal in here of John, I think, is to demonstrate that Jesus fulfills everything that the festivals are for, or what they point to is in fact Jesus, and that he surpasses the Jewish festivals. There's going to be in this section of John, there's going to be 4 festivals that we're going to talk about, but I want to kind of point out here, as I do in my notes, that there's 3 pilgrim festivals that I previously mentioned. So a pilgrim festival would be where the Jewish law requires that all the Jews in the region would have to head to Jerusalem, make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival in Jerusalem at the temple. And 2 of the festivals that we're going to discuss are in fact pilgrim festivals. But one of them is another festival, and then the other is the Sabbath. So I'll kind of point on that for a second. In John 5, what we're going to study today is the Sabbath. We're going to see how Jesus is showing that he fulfills the Sabbath and that he's greater than the Sabbath. And then in future lessons, we're going to talk about the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're going to talk about the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles and the Feast of the Dedication or Hanukkah. And just in touching on those a bit, the Feast of the Dedication or Hanukkah is a festival that commemorates, it's one we haven't talked about up to this point. It's one that commemorates the rededication of the Jewish temple in the 2nd century BC after the Maccabean revolt. You can see that on the slide here. But Judas Maccabees and his brothers led a revolt and were able to get some sense of independence back in the 2nd century before Christ. And in doing so, they were able to reclaim the temple and reclaim Jerusalem, and they were able to rededicate the temple back to Yahweh, back to God, and resume their practices of worship. And so that was what the Feast of Dedication or Hanukkah celebrates or remembers. But today we're going to talk on the Sabbath. And the big thing about the Sabbath here is that we don't always think of that as a festival, but it really is a weekly festival. It's a weekly remembrance, a weekly recurrence that's mandated in the Bible. It's mandated in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and it's a day that's supposed to be set aside for worship and also that it's a day that we're supposed to refrain from working. So we're going to kind of jump into that and see how Jesus is in fact showing and demonstrating that he's greater than the Sabbath. In the next chapters, we're going to see this escalation of conflict. So we're going to look for that here. We're going to see that there's a forensic motif established, according to Cook, which just means simply that he's going to be speaking in terms that are reminiscent or bring to mind, I should say, the idea of prosecution, of a lawsuit, of bringing a claim against Christ, in fact. And we're going to see in chapter 18 that John's trial actually begins, that Jesus, or I mean, sorry, that Jesus, in chapter 18 of John, he records Jesus's trial actually beginning. But in many ways, the interrogations and the collection of evidence, so to speak, begins here in chapter 5. What we're going to see here is that Jesus is going to be on trial for the primary charge of blasphemy, for who he claims to be. And there's a lot of people who have different ideas of who Jesus is, but what we're going to focus on is who does Jesus claim to be? And I think we're going to see that here a lot in John 5. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Bible and read through John 5, 1 through 18. We're going to break John 5 up into 3 sections here. And we're going to start in this conversation with 1 through 17. So I'll go ahead and read it. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know for sure what feast this was that he was making his way to Jerusalem for, but we know that he was making his way to Jerusalem for one of the feasts. And now there in Jerusalem by the sheep gate is a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades. A colonnade is something like a porch or an overhang. It's some kind of a structure that surrounded the pool. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and he knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And so, as we kind of look at that, let's just kind of walk through a few of the facts that'll help us here. There was a pool near the sheep gate in Jerusalem. So I think the sheep gate was an area where the animals that were made to be sacrificed would be brought into Jerusalem and ultimately into the temple to be sacrificed. It was probably, I think the Aramaic word is mikvah, or a cleansing pool. So it was probably a pool that could be used for ritual cleansing. And it was described as having 5 sides. 5 colonnades, roofed colonnades. So something like porches or overhangs that would be there for people to perhaps get shade from the sun or the elements while they were near the pool, or perhaps for some other purpose. But this was considered to be very unusual, that there would be a 5-sided pool type structure that would be built. By the way, this pool was likely fed by a natural spring or a stream that would then feed this pool. And so up until 1960, a lot of skepticism was about this, that it would be so unusual to have a 5-sided structure like this. But in 1960, this site was excavated by a German team led by an archaeologist named Konrad Schick. And they found that there was a pool here. And actually, technically, it was 2 pools that were in rectangular shape in collectively, they were in a rectangular shape with colonnades around all four sides, and then a colonnade dividing the two pools in the middle. So it explains how there was 5 porches or colonnades. So up until 1960, there was a lot of skepticism about the likelihood that this was a historical fact. But at that excavation, those archaeologists were able to determine that, in fact, there is a pool just like that, right where that it would expected to be. There's also another really interesting verse here. So we know that this pool is surrounded by invalids, and you want to recall that many of these people probably were prohibited from entering the temple for worship. In fact, they may all have been considered unclean, or because of their debilitating issues that they had, or sickness, or health problems, that they'd probably not be allowed to worship in there. And so what likely would happen is these people would be around this pool because they believed that the pool had some kind of mystical healing powers. Now, I kind of am surprised that Cook didn't touch on this a little bit more. He did allude to it, but if you look in your Bibles, and I'm gonna literally be looking at mine here as we talk, you may see that there's no verse 4. Or you might see that there's a note or something like that. But if you look at some of the early manuscripts, did not have this verse 4, and so some people question whether it was added later. It's not really for sure, but there's a very controversial verse here that is included in some early manuscripts, and it says something along the lines. I'll read just like 2 through 5, including this verse. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which have 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now here's verse 4. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed, and whatever disease he had was healed of whatever disease he had. So while this may or may not be part of John's original gospel, I'd say maybe it wasn't. It probably gives us some indication as to what kind of mythology or what kind of ideas happened. Maybe it's not even mythology. Maybe it's something that happened, that people were healed in this pool. It seems to kind of flow kind of to the opposite of what we would expect here, I think, or what the rest of the Bible would point us to. But what they believed perhaps was that the water would be stirred, and when it was stirred, that it was an angel that was stirring the water, probably outside of their ability to see it, and then that the first person who would get into this pool would be healed of whatever sickness or disease that he had. And in this case, this paralytic is saying, look, I'm basically so helpless that I can't even get into the pool. Every time I try to get into the pool, there's nobody that can help me get into the pool. And by the time I get toward the pool, or I can close to come to getting in the pool, I'm unable to get in there, or somebody else has already beaten me to it. So I'm never going to be able to get healed. And so one thing the text doesn't say, regardless of whether you include that verse, is that Jesus believed that the water was being stirred by an angel. So whether this is mythology, whether this is some kind of a weird addition to the text later, I really don't know. But whatever it is, there was certainly some kind of idea that this pool had some kind of healing powers. And so when Jesus came by this paralytic and said, do you want to be healed? He's saying, hey, I can't get into the pool first. Again, when you look at some of the archaeology and that type of thing, there's probably an idea that there was some kind of a spring that actually stirred up the water in the pool from time to time, or something of that nature. But nonetheless, we see something's happening here, and his encounter with Jesus is to suggest that this man is in a desperate situation. He's been rehabilitated for over 38 years, and likely some kind of a paralysis. There's a hint in verse 14 that Jesus says, sin no more, that nothing worse might happen to you. So we get an indication that it might have been his sin that caused this to happen to him, though we don't know that for certain. It seems to imply that. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here in this verse. Oops, sorry. Let me get to where I was at. So ultimately, Jesus had compassion on this man, and he told him to pick up his bed and walk. And so he was healed. He healed him. He picked up his bed and he walked. And then what we see here in the second half of this chapter is we see that he's been confronted now by the Jewish leadership. So he's there, he's near or at the time of a festival in Jerusalem. There's a lot of people around. This man's healed. There's probably a commotion around it. Jesus slips off into the crowd somewhere, and this man is confronted for carrying his mat or his bed. And when he's confronted, he says, "Hey, look, the guy who healed me is the one who told me to carry my bed." And that's because he was being accused of breaking the law on the Sabbath by carrying his bed. And Cook points out that there was 39 categories of work that was forbidden by the Sabbath the by the Jewish leadership, the tradition of the Jewish leadership. This is again it's not necessarily forbidden by the law of Moses, not necessarily by the Pentateuch, but the tradition of the Jewish tradition was that their leadership had built up all these extra rules that were supposed to help them in carrying out the commands of God. And in fact, they kind of became additional laws or requirements on themselves. And one of the requirements said that you couldn't carry a load from one dwelling to another. And so when they saw him that he was carrying this load, they said, "Hey, you're not supposed to be doing this on the Sabbath." And immediately this man kind of threw Jesus under the bus. Now he didn't know his name, so he said, "Hey, somebody who healed me told me to do this." And they asked who it was. He didn't know. And then later, Jesus has this encounter with this man at the temple and says, "Hey, make sure that you don't sin anymore so that something worse than even this might not happen to you." And when he does that, Cook comments that perhaps maybe the man was offended. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. We don't really know for sure from the text. You can maybe draw some conclusions by reading between the lines, but we don't really know for sure. But he turns around and goes and throws Jesus under the bus and tells the Jewish leadership that it's he who that it was Jesus who healed him, and it was Jesus who told him to carry his mat and break the law of the Sabbath. And so that's kind of how we see it. And when Jesus is being confronted by the Jewish leadership, it says that at the end of this section, it says, "The man who went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working till now, and I am working.'" And we're going to get into I don't know if it's a confrontation, but an exposition of Jesus explaining why he has the authority to do these things on the Sabbath. We're going to get into that in the next lesson. But I think what's important to notice here at the end of this is that it says the Jews were persecuting him for doing these things on the Sabbath. And as I was thinking about this today in preparation for teaching this, I was convicted of something myself, and that is that we can get tunnel vision. Dr. Cook says that these Jewish leaders were guilty of having tunnel vision. They began to persecute Jesus for instructing a person to carry a mat and for healing a person on the Sabbath, but they failed to recognize the work that Jesus was doing amongst them. They failed to recognize the bigger picture, which is that he just healed a person, that he just healed a man, and that healing was pointing to something much, much bigger than the healing itself. And so this is another one of John's signs, healing the lame man on the Sabbath. It's the third sign. And we're seeing some discourse that's beginning here and that continues into the next section, which will be another one of the 7 discourses. And that said, what convicted me or pointed me out to it is that so many times we can have tunnel vision and we can fail to see what God's doing in our midst. I was even thinking of a recent opportunity in ministry that I had kind of put my name forward for, and wondering like what God would do with that, and feeling called to do that. And then when the idea that, hey, what happens if this doesn't go my way, or if I'm not used by God in the way that I hope that I would be, I started to have some doubts and questions about it. And I had to kind of think to myself, am I worried about my position or my idea, or even a position I don't even have, an idea of what I hope to be able to do or how people might view me? Or am I, and if I am worried about those things, am I failing to see the much bigger and more wonderful work that God's doing right in my presence? And I think that's something that we need to think about is, sort of like John the Baptist when he said, I must be less, I must decrease, so he must increase. And I think that's something that you can take from this here in chapter 5 as well, is that these Jewish leaders, they're thinking, hey, I'm the priest. My livelihood depends upon these festivals, upon the Sabbath, upon people honoring the law of the Lord. And if that's changing, if that's getting turned upside down, what would that mean for me? And I think it's easy for us to just look at them and say, wow, they're sitting there persecuting Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, when we don't really think of like what happened, why would they do that, and what would it be like for them? And I think it's easier to get tunnel vision than we might think. So perhaps we should be praying that God would keep us from tunnel vision and help us to keep our eyes open to the work that He's doing amidst us, and to be happy for what role we might have, regardless of whether it's big or small, or um, how it shapes up compared to how we think it should shape up. So that's kind of something that I took from it today. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. It's a short lesson, and hopefully it's helpful. And we'll jump into, in the next lesson, Jesus' response, more in particular, his teaching on why he has this authority over the Sabbath. So thank you for joining me today.